You're watching Maverick Media. Educate, organize, act.
What parallels can you draw between the Vietnam War that went on for so long, with the one escalation after another, with the two ongoing wars, insofar as what did these policies do to break down the military and push morale down and cause disgruntled soldiers and people coming back with PTSD and not getting the help they need in this? What kind of parallels along those lines can you see between Vietnam and now?
I'm not a specialist on that subject. My time in the military in the 50s was in peacetime. And as I say, walked with soldiers in combat. I did see combat in Vietnam as a civilian. But it was, the PTSD effects later, of course, seemed to even surpass even the suicides are said to have surpassed the combat deaths eventually that can be attributed. And that seems to be happening now. Yeah. And of course, the injury problem, which rarely gets reported, we only see accounts of deaths pretty much. As I understand it, the injuries are getting worse and worse and more pervasive, in part because, as you know, of the body armor and and even the helmets have a perverse effect that they keep people alive, but at the cost of greater injuries than they would have, or injuries that would have led to death before. Lead to, in some cases, you could say, injuries that are treatable, recoverable, but very often to paraplegics and to brain damage that's really terribly serious. And so we're seeing more of that than we saw before, rarely counted as costs of the effort. Hard for Americans to keep in mind, by the way, just to change the context here a little, that every time we talk about combat casualties or combat deaths, we should realize that the same penalties are being inflicted often tenfold on the population of the other country, the country that they're operating. And often, by the way, very little account is taken, we're very little concerned about the deaths of enemy soldiers. What exactly had Iraqi soldiers done to threaten the United States or anyone else since Kuwait, a dozen years earlier, 10 years earlier, to merit their death, their execution? They were defending their country against a clear-cut crime against the peace, against aggression as clear-cut as the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, perhaps more so to some degree. Aggression as clear-cut as Hitler's invasion of Poland. Or Saddam's invasion of Kuwait. In each case, they were defending their country. Their deaths, as far as I could see, were unjustifiable homicide, murder. And although international law does not count killings by soldiers under command, by troops, as murder, even if it's a war of aggression. They're not subject to prosecution. Lawyers have explained to me. But how about the higher-ups and the people who send the soldiers over to kill in those countries? I'm saying it's murder, and not only of the civilians who are killed in the, quote, crossfire or as deliberate targets, it's murdering of enemy troops, of quote, enemy troops. Saddam's troops were not enemies of the United States, period. They were not enemies of the United States, and they had not earned death. Now, in Afghanistan, what Ho is reporting is that we're killing people, a lot of civilians by any standard, and other people who are recruited for a variety of motives, but including the motive to expel foreign invaders, foreign occupiers, which is what we are. What right do we have to be killing them? I would say none, no right. We have not earned the right, nothing has given us the right to have killed people in Afghanistan. And if people say 9/11, the Taliban, as it is today, and really as it was then, was very little involved in, except by giving haven to Al-Qaeda. And in other words, no more involved, let's say, than, well, it was a little more voluntary than in the case of Germany, where the plotting was done in Hamburg, or this country, you might say. But all right, the Taliban leadership at that time, as I understand it, largely for money and perhaps to some extent ideologically, gave haven, sanctuary to Al-Qaeda at that time. But Al-Qaeda isn't there now, and hasn't been there for a long time. And it hasn't been made clear to me at all how the Taliban are enemies of the United States or threaten our security. But you perhaps can elaborate on that. Tell me, what am I missing?
No, I agree with everything you said, and I think those are all really important points, especially when we look at the fact that both of these wars are being carried forward under the bogus reasons proposed by the Bush administration, and those aren't being challenged. You know, like what happened to Osama bin Laden, and you know, this all of a sudden now it's about, you know, we have to bring reconstruction to Afghanistan, or stability to Kabul, or women's rights. You know, again, all these bogus reasons, just like in Iraq, and there's just no grounds to them. One thing I want to ask you also is that and you probably run into this, I would imagine too, as you go around giving talks and with the new film and such, but when I give talks about Afghanistan or Iraq and what's happening in the military, the most common question I get just about every time I give a talk is someone will stand up and say, look, these are really dark times, both these ongoing endless wars, Obama's clearly not delivering on all of his promises of these grand changes that were to be made and ending the wars and making things better. What should I do, or what should we do? So I would like to hear your answer to that.
Let's start with yours, because you know the area much better than I do. You know, to talk about what we should do as opposed to what we should not do, which I think can be said from a great distance and without a tremendous immersion in the realities there. To say that we should not send scores and hundreds of thousands of troops there, you really do not have to be a regional expert to say that. Now, right. You are a regional expert, and that is a much better basis for saying what are the more realistic and options to be alternatives that are worth considering.
Well, I think for starters, I want to talk about it in a regional context with the Middle East and Afghanistan, but then also just with folks here at home who feel kind of snowed under with one horrible piece of information after another, whether it's climate change or nuclear issues or the economy or both these wars. So we'll split it up into two. But regionally, you know, in Iraq, it's much more clear-cut than Afghanistan because according to the most recent Brookings Institute poll that I've seen, 76% of Iraqis are in favor of total, complete withdrawal of all occupation forces, including contractors. So that's pretty clear, you know, given that Iraq is, of course, not our country, never was, never will be, and that the vast, vast majority of the people there want an end to the occupation. And I think it's real simple. If they're willing to take the risk of a power vacuum, et cetera, it's their country, end of discussion. In Afghanistan, I'm not a diplomat, I'm not a strategist, I don't really know what the solution is, but I would certainly agree that sending more troops and upping the amount of combat operations is only going to fuel an increasing insurgency there.
You know, when you say we don't know, we're not diplomats and so forth, I think we could probably agree on the following, that a very good thing for Americans to do, since most of the people in the government are not more informed about the situation than you are, certainly than you are, or even than I am, despite the fact that they read intelligence reports and so forth, but which may or may not give them more than the newspapers do.
Good point.
But given that, they should be listening. They should be asking for help and advice, and I would start with people in the area, be listening a lot more broadly to all factions, not just in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but their neighbors in the whole area, including people who have a stake one way or another in the area. And that, I take it, includes Russia, China, Iran, and others. And I haven't actually heard what advice the Russians would give us. Now, but just on a military line, I would think that it is culpable. It is almost sure that we are not listening to Russian generals or majors or journalists to tell us what's going to happen to us with the next, which should be the first step. And the reason I'm sure of that is we didn't do it with the French. Say the French, they lost 2 world wars. The Soviets, well, we know how bad they were, terrible army. It's not as obvious. The Soviets did not lose a world war. Well, they did actually, the first. But the Second World War, they didn't exactly lose. And why we dismiss their military prowess so easily is not clear to me. But I think they should be listening to people who are involved there as to what they ran into with programs of the same kind we're talking about right now, against the same people, same terrain. We should be learning. But on the diplomatic side, what do the Russians and others feel? What do they say? It isn't that we should just do whatever they say. We should hear what they have to say. Do you actually know what their advice is on this?
I've spoken to some Russian journalists I've been doing some interviews around my new book, and of course I always ask them, so let's talk about Afghanistan, and that's where they reminded me of, oh yes, Afghanistan, the place where empires go to die. There's a lot of history to back that claim up too, I think that would be a grand idea to listen to them, and of course that's clearly not what's happening.
But take all the people that we dismiss, our opponents, our potential adversaries and so forth, like the Chinese. I would say it'd be interesting to hear what they had to say about this, and I don't happen to know. I'm sure we do listen a lot to what the Israelis think we ought to do, but they're not the only ones we should be listening to by any means. So that would be one thing. And then what deals are possible there? Here's where you and I, certainly I am not equipped to say. What deals might various factions of the Taliban actually be willing to make here, and how could they be enforced or inspected? What are the real stakes in Pakistan? For example, we hear as a major reason for staying in Afghanistan that to get out would destabilize Pakistan. As a layman, but who's trying to understand the situation, I don't get that one. What I've heard doesn't suggest to me why that's going to destabilize Pakistan. After all, the Taliban themselves were virtually created by Pakistan, ISI, the intelligence service, with our encouragement and our money to a large extent. They maintain major relations with the Taliban, I understand, as a counterweight to the Indians, and in Kashmir in particular. And they're friendly to the Taliban in Afghanistan. The Taliban in Pakistan may be a different matter. So why exactly would it destabilize them if the Taliban were again in power in Kabul? And again, tell me, what am I missing there? You know a lot more about it than I do. Is there a basis for saying that Pakistan with its nuclear weapons would be stabilized by a Taliban rule in Afghanistan?
A lot of this rhetoric comes from justifications to continue.
Yeah, it's just given any reason. You could say it's like Bush saying, put me in office so I can continue occupying Iraq, so I can protect you at home. Well, he's not protecting us at home. It's the opposite. He's doing the opposite. He's causing danger. But it's an argument. And if it's made with enough confidence, it can work. Is there more to this than that? Is there any basis for saying that we have to stay or escalate in Afghanistan for reasons of our interests in Pakistan?
I don't think there is, because if we just simply step back and broaden the perspective and look back in time, just what was the situation in Pakistan before the Americans started occupying Afghanistan, and what is it today? Is it better or worse?
What's the answer?
Well, clearly, it's far, far worse. Far worse. We didn't have, every other day, huge acts of terrorism happening in Pakistan. We didn't have the Pakistani military plowing down parts of the country on these operations. We didn't have U.S. drone attacks.
It occurs to me that what McChrystal and others are saying is, well, that's happening as a result of the Taliban getting stronger in Afghanistan, and that shows what would happen if they got even stronger, so we've got to stop that. And of course that leaves out of the story why they're stronger. And they're stronger from every evidence since and because we've put more troops in since 2005. Isn't that the case?
Exactly.
So the argument is actually the reverse of what he's saying, but on its surface, it seems to have some plausibility. Look, the Taliban is getting stronger in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, therefore, we've got to, whereas the Ho is saying the way to reverse that process is to reduce our troops in Afghanistan and have less recruits for the Taliban. And if I'm not mistaken, we're pressing Pakistan to go into Swat and to North Waziristan, or South Waziristan, and that in turn is causing, the pressure that we're encouraging is causing the upsurge in terrorist incidents in Pakistan. Is that not the case?
That's exactly correct.
So again, we have a reverse of the causal links that seem to be realistic, and there is great precedent for that. I go back to one of the great examples of all history, George Bush able to run for a second term on the grounds that he is defending us at home by occupying Iraq, when all intelligence agencies say that the effect is the reverse of that he's endangering us, and yet he successfully sold it to such an extent that Kerry was unwilling to challenge him on it in the campaign, did not make the war a major issue in his campaign, any more than he did torture.
And so finally, Dan Ellsberg, what would you say to specifically the people in this country that have been anti-war, taking actions against both occupations, and now have had the wind completely taken out of their sails by this kind of gutless Obama administration, and people there's really not much of a powerful anti-war movement, not a whole lot of organizing happening, and morale is low, and people are kind of wringing in their hands. What do we do? What do we do? Yeah. And I'll talk about this too, but what would you say to these people?
Well, it's funny, I was just reading a piece about by a guy named Tom Gallagher on the internet about where are all the anti-war demonstrators. And he took as his example in the lead the fact, a report in the paper that by the time Daniel Ellsberg addressed the latest rally in San Francisco, there were only a few dozen demonstrators left. He asked people why they had not come, and they gave a number of reasons that were really very reasonable, aside from the personal things, why they had missed this one. And they ranged from the fact that the largest demonstrations in history, human history, against a war, before a war, took place on February 15th, was it?
Correct.
In 2003, before the war, perhaps 10 to 15 million people worldwide in one day. Nothing ever like it anywhere. Had no perceptible effect. Interestingly, it's interesting, Noam Chomsky raises the possibility that there was a hidden effect more than people realized, that without that expression of public sentiment, the war would have happened, as it did anyway. But it could have been much bloodier than it was. I'd never seen this suggestion. It was bloody enough, obviously. But you notice the shock and awe did not continue as long as had earlier been predicted. You know, the bombing of Baghdad, the heavy bombing of Baghdad. And he suggests that they refrained from the kind of tactic that they used in, say, World War II or Korea. Firebombing of the cities was out of the question because of the degree of anti-war sentiment, that it might have been done otherwise. I've never seen that proposed. It's possible, though.
Yeah.
But of course, it didn't prevent the war, and they didn't see a real effect of it. And then other people said, recognizing the demonstration would probably not be very large, they didn't want to be demoralized by attending one more under strength, demonstration of weakness,
Yeah.
which might even be bad politically by showing there was not much popular resentment. I felt that myself, and then felt it's happening. Somebody's called this thing. I don't expect it to have much effect, or my presence to have any importance. But I'm going to be there anyway, rather than not go to demonstrate, to register my protest on this anniversary of the war. And I used the occasion to say that I thought it was not just the 8th anniversary of the Afghanistan war, but that this was could be regarded could turn out to be the first demonstration against a massive escalation of the war right now, and the first demonstration of the rest of our lives. And because if he does escalate, it will be the rest of our lives. So what to do? I'm not sure I disagree with the people who say that demonstrations per se, at this stage of our experience, do not seem very effective, do not get a lot of attention from the press, and or the society at large, and never did have that much effect on the executive branch directly. But I think that pressure on Congress, lobbying in various ways, and campaign activity, primary challenges to people who've supported the war, is more promising, although, again, we're not seeing, of course, much of that, but it's certainly called for. We need an anti-war movement. There's more promise at this moment, this week, for effective pressure on Congress and the executive than there has been for years, because Obama is, in fact, hesitating, to say the least, before he gives in to the military requests. So the chance of, and there is a struggle going on within the administration. I wouldn't have predicted that we'd find Rahm Emanuel, and along with Biden and others in the administration opposing the escalation, which could be very powerful. But that means there's something to work with there, to try to push one side, support one side rather than the other. I think there's a great unexploited potential for professional organizations and associations to take stands in contrast to their absolutely execrable silence over recent years. And I'm speaking of doctors versus the participation of doctors in torture, and versus torture altogether. The psychologists, at last, to join the psychiatrists and the medical association in denouncing torture. The American Psychological Association has been contemptible, really, in its reluctance to discourage their members from either taking part in torture or riling the military, on whom they depend for contracts. Again, to mention torture, which is a very clear-cut legal violation of domestic law, the Constitution, and international law. We haven't heard from lawyers' associations to the extent we should. There should be a lot of lawyers in the military, apparently. The Judge Advocate General were creditably spoke internally against this, the illegality of it, the wrongness of it, but not externally, as they should. So again, lawyers in general could be taking and rebuking, rejecting the views of their colleague John Yoo, the tenured professor at Bolt Hall in Berkeley, whose views are anti-scholarly, actually, totally deceptive, even though he may believe them to some extent himself. But I hold his fellows much more accountable for failing to point out the legal invalidity of the arguments he's making. So I think, in other words, you could do a lot to delegitimize these measures, including, of course, the major abuses of the Constitution, which are being continued under Obama. Actually, I was pressing a lawyer friend of mine last night to explain to me who wants to give still Obama more benefit of the doubt and so forth. Just how does this constitutional law teacher, Obama, differ in his actions, in his policies, from that other constitutional law scholar, John Yoo? He gave me what he thought were some examples. I wasn't impressed by them. And we're not getting much benefit of his, any benefit, I would say, of his teaching of constitutional law, his positions on signing statements and on rendition, but in particular the continuation, which he voted for, of, in the end, of the warrantless wiretapping by NSA. You know, very ominous, I think. Okay, that's what's to be expected from a president. Really, any president, any party. But the question is, will Congress and the courts and the legal profession and other professions do what they can to point out how out of line he is in our constitutional traditions and laws? So there are areas that I think, by the way, too, calling out the media is something that was not done in Vietnam very much and should be done now. Of course, the newspapers are kind of reeling anyway now, and you might say this is piling on. Well, maybe that's the very time when there's a vulnerability to point out, for example, to your local newspaper, what we can now point out. Here's what appeared on antiwar.com or commondreams.org from all across the country. Here's a story that was covered by 17 other newspapers. How come you missed it? That could be done to the New York Times almost daily. Stories that are covered elsewhere that don't make it into the New York Times somehow in quite a pattern of events. I think pressure like that would be well worthwhile.
Okay. Well, Dan Ellsberg, thank you very much for your time. It's been great talking with you today.
Hey, talk to you.